Hello, and a very warm welcome in joining us this afternoon. My name is Georgine Leung. I'm a nutritionist, food consultant, and a PhD researcher at UCL, looking at the food practices of mothers in the postpartum period. Today, we're going to have an overview of the strategies in building cultural awareness when delivering healthy eating messages in the primary classroom. First of all, a big thank you to Food A Fact of Life and the team at British Nutrition Foundation for inviting me today. In this webinar, we're going to cover some pointers on ethnicity, health and diet, examining the available UK evidence, and then we're going to move on to thinking about what a traditional diet means, traditional foods, world foods, and how then they fit into our everyday food culture. We then move on to the Eat Well guide and the ways it can be adapted to different food cultures and teaching a wide variety of foods to your primary students. And finally, we're going to have a discussion on ways to engage with pupils from different cultural backgrounds. And hopefully I'll be able to speak with you more during the Q&A session. First and foremost, it is important that we understand ethnicity as a very complex and multi-dimensional concept. It's shaped by so many different factors, such as shared history between different people, family origins, language, cultural traditions, religion, and so on. According to the 2021 census, which is the latest that provides data on minority ethnic data, 15% of the people in England identified themselves as belonging to an ethnic minority group such as Asian, Black, and others. However, it is important to understand that race is a fluid concept and these categories may not encompass all the cultural backgrounds that people identify themselves with. It is also worth noting that members of the same family may share different cultures and identify differently across the generations. For this reason, it's very difficult to capture health outcomes just based on race. Obesity research has found that South Asians tend to have a higher amount of body fat at a lower BMI that calls for earlier health interventions with more accurate weight ranges in order to control their risk for type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. However, race is only one factor in determining health. What are the most important drivers to health are socioeconomic and deprivation backgrounds, and they are much better indicators of any health outcomes for any individuals, regardless of their ethnic background. There are a couple of large birth cohort studies, one of which is the Born in Bradford study in the UK, which examined over 13.5 children in Bradford to look at any determinants of childhood and childhood disease. And what it found was, compared to white British homes, Pakistani homes were more likely to have and serve fruit and sugar sweetened beverages compared to water. And this is done as a sign of hospitality. And of course, nowadays, these drinks' cheapness and the desirability have also influenced personal consumption as well. So it's very important to think about these wider factors in determining health outcomes and behaviors of certain groups in the population. These ideas are useful in exploring any changes in health behaviors and to examine them across different generations of migrant families as well. And importantly, we also know that people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to experience poor health outcomes. And some ethnic groups, such as those from Bangladeshi or Pakistani adults, are more likely to have a social economic classification of a lower status, and they too might be more likely to experience poor health outcomes because of this. And of course, we know that there are so many drivers to food choice. We all eat because of different factors. So apart from cultural background, there are some more pragmatic concerns. For example, access to any foods, healthy foods, traditional foods, the availability of income to purchase these foods, preparation time, and so on. And so it is very important when we talk about any health differences, we should consider these wider aspects of food choice and how we eat, And the messages should come across as inclusive rather than patronizing, as it's very easy to risk stigmatization when we talk about ethnic backgrounds, certain food habits, and so on. And this is why terminology really matters and representation matters when we talk about healthy eating across the population. And of course, the understanding of people's lived experiences in a very complex daily lives nowadays. And that's why, apart from looking at quantitative data, it is also critical for us to examine any qualitative research available to identify people's reasons behind these food choices as well. And when it comes to the way of eating, it is important to address that social and community eating, for example, across different settings like families or religious groups, they do play a huge role in certain minority ethnic groups. And this is why context is key in understanding what works for any food and nutrition or health interventions. Apart from food, we are also interested in looking at physical activity habits amongst people of minority ethnic groups. And according to this report by Sport England in 2020, we know that children from minority groups or certain groups are less likely to be as active as their white counterparts. The reasons are multifold, very complex, but the issue of representation has been raised for some sports, such as swimming, basketball, cricket. Some sports are more represented and some are less represented when it comes to an overall balance of people from different backgrounds. There are also inequalities across physical activity levels that can be further exacerbated by their socio-economic backgrounds as well. This is why when it comes to exercising, when it comes to promoting physical activity, it's important that we address aspects like access to facilities or girls-only facilities, the idea of taking part equally with confidence, learning the benefits of exercise through education, and importantly, the enjoyment of physical activity as well. We must consider all of these in order to promote the widening participation of children from different backgrounds across all sports. As food teachers, I'm sure you appreciate the power of food in teaching different subjects across the curriculum. Not just food itself, not just nutrition or any practical cookery skills. They are very important, of course, but also cross-curricularly, how food then offers a lens to examine subjects like geography, history, languages, and so on. And of course, food from all around the world offers meaning to different young people in the classroom and is a way to connect with their culture and perhaps also to mark their social identity with their peers as well. And when it comes to traditional foods and diets, sometimes it's quite easy to fall into a trap of thinking how food traditions never change. And nowadays is rarely the case. And we know that dietary assimilation occurs. There are intergenerational differences in migrant families, for example. So it's very important to think about what food traditional means and not fall into the trap of assuming certain people eating traditional foods and diets. Of course, there are traditions, but then I think we need to think of traditional foods and the way people eat in a more fluid approach. And when we think of traditional foods, flavors, actually they are all in flux with whatever is popular on the market these days. I can think of the bubble tea drink, which itself was a creation in Asia a few decades ago. And some of the flavors available used to be more exotic, for example, and less available, but nowadays they have become mainstream, for example, the curry dish. And there are these cooking techniques, for example, steaming and air frying. I can only think that they were more popular for certain types of cooking back in the day. They have now become more popular specifically for health reasons because they use less oil. So I thought that was quite interesting to think about the changes even in the last 5 to 10 years or so. So what are world foods? Well, in a nutshell, world foods refer to the types of foods and flavors from different cuisines around the world. The exchanges of foods and flavors have happened throughout millennia, and in recent history, we know that foods have been brought through trade routes, through migration of different people, and more recently through international travels. And of course, nowadays, we see what people on the other side of the world are eating through social media pretty instantaneously. So there's massive availability of information offers us new horizons and understanding how people eat around the world, and perhaps the curiosity in trying different foods and flavors too. Or to any supermarket these days in the UK, you probably see a world foods aisle. Historically, these provide product offerings include Asian, Chinese cuisines. They still are the two most popular cuisine types yet, but increasingly we find other types such as African Caribbean, American, Pan-Asian, Eastern European, and Irish. Also, there are foods which are associated to faiths such as halal and kosher products and linked to specific festivals too. Recently, we just celebrated Diwali last week, and I'm sure it's very hard to miss all the very interesting and colourful sweet offerings available at the supermarket. And this is why, if you think about it, world foods actually encompass quite a massive retail sector and can be quite fluid in terms of how they are defined as well. These days, you'll be able to find products which you might associate with more exotic flavors being available at mainstream aisles, perhaps just branded differently. These include starchy staples from rice noodles to breads, canned beans and pulses, to items like coconut milk. And of course, price is an important factor in influencing what we choose to buy and eat. So it'd be interesting to compare and contrast two very similar products, branded differently, and placed at different sections of the supermarkets as a little activity for your students as well. And perhaps with the influence from the pandemic and a squeeze in household incomes these days, it's been found that people are more likely to do home cooking to recreate some of the flavors that they normally would find eating out. So this is actually a very exciting opportunity for food teachers to be able to influence and encourage students to try more flavors and foods that they normally wouldn't cook or experience at home. Mintel, the market intelligence agency, published a very interesting report earlier this year. They interviewed over 1,800 internet users about their habits and preferences over consuming world cuisines at home. What they found about the two most relevant statements with regards to consuming world cuisines are trying new cuisines that will share an ingredient with another world cuisine that the consumer will enjoy, and that the world cuisine products that are suitable for energy efficient cooking appliances like slow cooking, air fryers, would be quite appealing to the consumer as well. And these are very pragmatic reasons when we think about world cuisines and generally cooking at the home. And perhaps with more cooking done over the last couple of years during the pandemic, with more working from home, this might have completely shifted the market in terms of thinking about what cooking from scratch really means. Meal kits are still important, but there seems to be an increasing interest for consumers to actually dabble with individual ingredients and actually mix and match and using whatever is available. So there is a lot of potential to teach our young learners for them to think beyond the box, the meal kit box perhaps, a little bit, and actually consider what they can mix and match using what is available in the kitchen, and not having to purchase new ingredients or specific sauces or condiments just to cook one recipe. This will also help boost confidence in the kitchen and actually think about healthy eating in much broader context, mixing and matching foods from the same food group and actually being able to deliver very similar nutritional benefits with a focus on basing meals on starchy foods and eating plenty of fruit and vegetables, as well as including some protein sources. So further, this report also offers some insight into understanding some of the most appealing factors when choosing a world cuisine product for leisure occasions, so over the weekends and days off at home. And it seems that authenticity is still the most important factor in determining whether they like the product or not, and that they can adapt the product to different flavor preferences. For example, if someone likes spicy food, they can actually add, say, some chili sauce to it to make it more suitable to their taste palette, or a product which actually replicates a favorite restaurant dish as well. This perhaps shows that consumers these days are much more curious about what the food is all about, authentic flavors, for example. So apart from going down the work food aisle these days and the supermarket, your high street supermarket, it might be also worthwhile if there are specific specialist cuisine shops around the corner, which seem to be more and more popular these days. And I've got some images for you here on the top left hand corner. Have a guess of what these bottles are all about. Yes, so they are bottles of soya sauce and sesame oil at a Korean supermarket in New Malden outside of London. I've always found going to these specialist shops really exciting, especially looking at the wide range of vegetables available, lots of interesting greens that you don't normally see at the mainstream high street supermarket. For some of the larger ones, they might even offer different kinds of meats and seafood, like a seafood counter, which you find a larger variety of seafood available. And that's great to talk about healthy eating, including sources of seafood, where food comes from, and the cooking styles as well that you can use to recreate some of the dishes that you might have tried outside of the home, recreating it in the domestic kitchen. I'm also thinking about dishes that are so common and popular these days, like these dips, for example, guacamole and hummus, which have become so popular for a lot of families around the UK. You might buy it in your weekly shop or purchase it specifically to host some play dates or family get-togethers. And this is why when we think about authenticity, there are dishes which have been so popularized by the UK audience. And this is why knowing about the different foods available to perhaps create some authentic flavors that consumers might have tried outside the home. This is a very exciting space, and I think there will be a lot more synergy when it comes to using ingredients much more creatively in the home kitchen. I'm sure you're all very familiar with the Eat Well guide, which sets out the types and proportions of foods which make up a healthy, varied diet. These illustrations have been selected to be representative of what people eat in the UK, but of course there are lots of other foods which have not been depicted on the Eat Well guide. So you might want to adapt the Eat Well guide to your classroom when teaching about different food cultures and specific foods for students of different backgrounds. One great way is to ask students to bring in foods which like or representative of their own cultural traditions and so on. There are also food cards available that you can print out and talk about where they belong to on the Eat Well guide. It might be also worthwhile to take a different approach, for example, a more sensory approach to encourage students and learners to talk, describe, and perhaps write down what they think about these foods. If you're interested about this, you can download some resources from TasteEd, which supports teachers in delivering sensory food education in the classroom and beyond. You might have also come across these adapted Eat Well guides, which are put together by private and other charity bodies. as an example on how to embed traditional foods into teaching about healthy eating. One features African Caribbean foods and the other South Asian diets. But of course, foods such as carrots and bananas, staples such as all kinds of pasta available, bread, rice, breakfast cereals, dairy products, and some meat and fish products are widely consumed around the UK anyway. So in a way, it's interesting to think we have more in common than not. And when teaching your students, there will be learners who can relate to other food cultures and perhaps different food cultures at the same time. And it'll be really interesting to explore these. Another fun activity might be for young learners to create their own Eat Well guide using foods which they like, enjoy, and also representative of what they consider as their own food culture. And when it comes to learning about the different ingredients available, there are really so many ways of cooking these. So apart from bringing pictures of the real foods that students might relate to, it might be worthwhile to also ask them to bring a picture of the dishes made from these foods to share with their peers in the classroom. What I have, for example, here is a papaya. And of course, papaya, generally, we have it as a fruit. But in some cultures, papayas are also made into soup broths with other ingredients like tomato and tofu and some fishtail, which is a very commonly consumed dish following childbirth. Another one is this king oyster mushroom that we like to cook into a stir fry or sometimes thrown into stews to increase your fibre a day. And the other one on the top right hand corner here is the bitter gourd. It's probably one of the most interesting vegetables available, if not the most. From what its name suggests, it tastes bitter. It's also got a very unusual shape too. I know bitter gourd is widely used in stews and curry dishes, but in Chinese cooking, we use it to stir fry with eggs, with pork, chicken, and sometimes fish fillets as well. Sometimes, if the bitter gourd is particularly bitter, you would salt it in advance and remove the bitter juices just to make it a bit more palatable. And of course, this might be quite advanced for primary learners to understand all this, and it might be an activity then to engage with the wider school community, including parents, grandparents, and other carers, and so on. Apart from the variety of foods, it's also important to understand different cooking techniques available to cook the same food. For example, fish. As an island nation, fish consumption in the UK is actually not very high. One of the most commonly consumed fish product is fish fingers, but not a lot of people, and certainly young people, take to whole fish or fish which looks intact as it is. So it might be interesting to see what your learners take to fish and what they think about cooking whole fish, say grilling or steaming. And of course, this can all start with a trip down to the fishmongers. Your students might all have a very different experience, and it'll be really interesting for them to have a conversation about this and talk about why they like or dislike fish and their favorite way of eating it as well. Of course, when learning about different food cultures, you can't miss the very exciting traditional festivals and festive foods which come with it. It's also a great opportunity to learn about world history as well as current affairs. There are so many examples of these. Some of the more notable festivals include the Lunar New Year, marked by so many events in Chinatown, the Hindu festivals of Holi, Festival of Colours, Diwali, which was just celebrated last week, where sweet foods are shared amongst family and friends, and Hanukkah, also the Festival of Lights marked by the Jewish community. There is also the aspect of fasting marked by the Muslim community, particularly during the month of Ramadan, where the iftar meal is eaten at sunset every day. Marking these occasions in the classroom can help create an inclusive atmosphere where students of different cultural backgrounds can share with their peers their experience of celebrating these traditional festivals and the foods which mark these occasions as well. There are also other foods which have symbolic significance marked by communities near and far. So if you've got anything you'd like to share, please do in the Q&A session which we're about to start. Thank you for listening and staying with us on this webinar, and I hope you found this useful. Thank you.